Section 8 of the Vedanta Sutras by Badarayana, with the commentary by Shankaracharya, Volume 1. Translated by George Thibault. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Introduction, Part 8. The result of this closer consideration of the first set of sutras, alleged by Shankara to concern the owner of the higher knowledge of Brahman, entitles us to view with some distrust Shankara's assertion that another set also, 4.1-7, has to be detached from the general topic of the fourth adhyaya and to be understood as depicting the condition of those who have obtained final absolute release. And the sutras themselves do not tend to weaken this preliminary want of confidence. In the first place, their wording also gives no indication whatever of their having to be separated from what precedes as well as what follows. And, in the second place, the last sutra of the set obliges Shankara to ascribe to his truly released souls qualities which clearly cannot belong to them, so that he finally is obliged to make the extraordinary statement that those qualities belong to them vyavaharapekshaya, while yet the purport of the whole Adhikarana is said to be the description of the truly released soul, for which no vyavahara exists. Very truly, Shankara's commentator here remarks, quote, Atra kekin moyanti akanda kin matra janan muktasya jnana bhavat kuta ajnanika dharma yoga, end quote. And the way in which thereupon he himself attempts to get over the difficulty certainly does not improve matters. In connection with the two passages discussed, we meet in the fourth adhyaya with another passage which indeed has no direct bearing on the distinction of apara and para-vidya, but may yet be shortly referred to in this place as another and altogether undoubted instance of Shankara's interpretations not always agreeing with the text of the sutras. The sutras 7-16 of the third pada state the opinions of three different teachers on the question to which Brahman the soul of the Vidvan repairs on death, or, according to Ramanuja, the worshippers of which Brahman repair to the highest Brahman. Ramanuja treats the view of Badari and Jaimini as two Purvapakshas, and the opinion of Badarayana, which is stated last, as the Vedantha. Shankara, on the other hand, detaching the sutras in which Badarayana's view is set forth from the preceding part of the Adhikarana, a proceeding which, although not plausible, yet cannot be said to be altogether illegitimate, maintains that Badari's view, which is expounded first, represents the Vedantha, while Jaimini's view, set forth subsequently, is to be considered a mere Purvapaksha. This, of course, is altogether inadmissible, it being the invariable practice of the Vedanta Sutras, as well as the Purvamimamsa Sutras, to conclude the discussion of contested points with the statement of that view which is to be accepted as the authoritative one. This is so patent that Shankara feels himself called upon to defend his deviation from the general rule. Commentary on 4.4.13, without, however, bringing forward any arguments but such as are valid only if Shankara's system itself is already accepted. The previous considerations leave us, I am inclined to think, no choice but to side with Ramanuja as to the general subject matter of the fourth adhyaya of the sutras. We need not accept him as our guide in all particular interpretations, but we must acknowledge with him that the sutras of the fourth adhyaya describe the ultimate fate of one and the same Vidvan, and do not afford any basis for the distinction of a higher and lower knowledge of Brahman in Shankara's sense. If we have not to discriminate between a lower and a higher knowledge of Brahman, it follows that the distinction of a lower and a higher Brahman is likewise not valid. But this is not a point to be decided at once on the negative evidence of the fourth adhyaya, but regarding which the entire body of the Vedanta Sutras has to be consulted. And intimately connected with this investigation, in fact one with it from a certain point of view, is the question whether the sutras afford any evidence of their author having held the doctrine of Maya, the principle of illusion, by the association with which the highest Brahman, in itself transcending all qualities, appears as the lower Brahman or Ishvara. That Ramanuja denies the distinction of the two Brahmans and the doctrine of Maya we have seen above. We shall, however, in the subsequent investigation, pay less attention to his views and interpretations than to the indications furnished by the sutras themselves. Placing myself at the point of view of a Shankara, I am startled at the outset by the second sutra of the first Adhyaya, which undertakes to give a definition of Brahman. Quote, Brahman is that whence the origination and so on, that is, the sustentation and reabsorption of this world proceed. End quote. What, we must ask, is this sutra meant to define? That Brahman, we are inclined to answer, whose cognition the first sutra declares to constitute the task of the entire Vedanta. That Brahman whose cognition is the only road to final release. That Brahman, in fact, which Shankara calls the highest. But here we must object to ourselves. The highest Brahman is not properly defined as that from which the world originates. In later Vedantic writings, whose authors were clearly conscious of the distinction of the higher absolute Brahman and the lower Brahman related to Maya or the world, we meet with definitions of Brahman of an altogether different type. I need only remind the reader of the current definition of Brahman as Sakit Ananda, or, to mention one individual instance, refer to the introductory slokas of the Pankadasi dilating on the Samvidsvayam Prabha, the self-luminous principle of thought which in all time, past or future, neither starts into being nor perishes. Quote, that from which the world proceeds, end quote, can by Shankara be accepted only as a definition of Ishvara, of Brahman, which by its association with Maya is enabled to project the false appearance of this world, and it certainly is as improbable that the sutras should open with the definition of that inferior principle, from whose cognition there can accrue no permanent benefit, as, according to a remark made above, it is unlikely that they should conclude with a description of the state of those who know the lower Brahman only, and thus are debarred from obtaining true release. As soon, on the other hand, as we discard the idea of a twofold Brahman and conceive Brahman as one only, as the all-enfolding being which sometimes emits the world from its own substance and sometimes again retracts it into itself, ever remaining one in all its various manifestations, a conception which need not by any means be modeled in all its details on the views of the Ramanujas, the definition of Brahman given in the second sutra becomes altogether unobjectionable. We next inquire whether the impression left on the mind by the manner in which Badarayana defines Brahman, namely, that he does not distinguish between an absolute Brahman and a Brahman associated with Maya, is confirmed or weakened by any other parts of his work. The sutras being throughout far from direct in their enunciations, we shall have to look less to particular terms and turns of expression than to general lines of reasoning. What in this connection seems specially worthy of being taken into account is the style of argumentation employed by the Sutrakara against the Shankya doctrine, which maintains that the world has originated not from an intelligent being, but from the non-intelligent pradana. The most important sutras relative to this point are to be met with in the first pada of the second Adhyaya. Those sutras are indeed almost unintelligible if taken by themselves, but the unanimity of the commentators as to their meaning enables us to use them as steps in our investigation. The sixth sutra of the pada mentioned replies to the Shankya objection that the non-intelligent world cannot spring from an intelligent principle by the remark that, quote, it is thus seen, end quote. That is, it is a matter of common observation that non-intelligent things are produced from beings endowed with intelligence, hair and nails, for instance, springing from animals, and certain insects from dung. Now, an argumentation of this kind is altogether out of place from the point of view of the true Shankara. According to the latter, the non-intelligent world does not spring from Brahman insofar as the latter is intelligence, but insofar as it is associated with Maya. Maya is the upadana of the material world, and Maya itself is of a non-intelligent nature, owing to which it is by so many Vedantic writers identified with the Prakriti of the Shankyas. Similarly, the illustrative instances adduced under Sutra 9 for the purpose of showing that effects, when being reabsorbed into their causal substances, do not impart to the latter their own qualities, and that hence the material world also, when being refunded into Brahman, does not impart to it its own imperfections, are singularly inappropriate if viewed in connection with the doctrine of Maya, according to which the material world is no more in Brahman at the time of a pralaya than during the period of its subsistence. According to Shankara, the world is not merged in Brahman, but the special forms into which the upadana of the world, that is, Maya, had modified itself are merged in non-distinct Maya, whose relation to Brahman is not changed thereby. The illustration, again, given in Sutra 24 of the mode in which Brahman, by means of its inherent power, transforms itself into the world without employing any extraneous instruments of action, quote, Kashiravad di, as milk of its own accord turns into curds, end quote, would be strangely chosen indeed if meant to bring nearer to our understanding the mode in which Brahman projects the elusive appearance of the world, and also the analogous instance given in the sutra next following, quote, as gods and the like create palaces, chariots, etc. by the mere power of their will, end quote, which refers to the real creation of real things, would hardly be in its place if meant to illustrate a theory which considers unreality to be the true character of the world. The mere cumulation of the two essentially heterogeneous illustrative instances, Kashiravad di Devadivat, moreover, seems to show that the writer who had recourse to them held no very definite theory as to the particular mode in which the world springs from Brahman, but was merely concerned to render plausible in some way or other that an intelligent being can give rise to what is non-intelligent without having recourse to any extraneous means. That the Maya doctrine was not present to the mind of the Sutrakara further appears from the latter part of the fourth pada of the first Adhyaya, where it is shown that Brahman is not only the operative but also the material cause of the world. If anywhere, there would have been the place to indicate, had such been the author's view, that Brahman is the material cause of the world through Maya only, and that the world is unreal, but the sutras do not contain a single word to that effect. Sutra 26, on the other hand, exhibits the significant term parinamat. Brahman produces the world by means of a modification of itself. It is well known that later on, when the terminology of the Vedanta became definitely settled, the term parinavada was used to denote that very theory to which the followers of Shankara are most violently opposed, namely, the doctrine according to which the world is not a mere vivarta, that is, an illusory manifestation of Brahman, but the effect of Brahman undergoing a real change. May that change be conceived to take place in the way taught by Ramanuja or in some other manner. With regard to the last quoted sutra, as well as to those touched upon above, the commentators indeed maintain that whatever terms and modes of expression are apparently opposed to the Vivartavada are in reality reconcilable with it. To Sutra 26, for instance, Govindananda remarks that the term parinama only denotes an effect in general, karya matra, without implying that the effect is real. But in cases of this nature we are fully entitled to use our own judgment, even if we were not compelled to do so by the fact that other commentators, such as Ramanuja, are satisfied to take parinama and similar terms in their generally received sense. A further section treating of the nature of Brahman is met with in 3-11 forward. It is, according to Shankara's view, of special importance, as it is alleged to set forth that Brahman is in itself destitute of all qualities, and is affected with qualities only through its limiting adjuncts, upadis, the offspring of Maya. I have above, in the conspectus of contents, given a somewhat detailed abstract of the whole section as interpreted by Shankara on the one hand, and Ramanuja on the other hand, from which it appears that the latter's opinion as to the purport of the group of sutras widely diverges from that of Shankara. The wording of the sutras is so eminently concise and vague that I find it impossible to decide which of the two commentators, if indeed either, is to be accepted as a trustworthy guide. Regarding the sense of some sutras, Shankara's explanation seems to deserve preference. In the case of others, Ramanuja seems to keep closer to the text. I decidedly prefer, for instance, Ramanuja's interpretation of Sutra 22 as far as the sense of the entire sutra is concerned, and more especially with regard to the term prakritaitavatvam, whose proper force is brought out by Ramanuja's explanation only. So much is certain that none of the sutras decidedly favors the interpretation proposed by Shankara. Whichever commentator we follow, we greatly miss coherence and strictness of reasoning, and it is thus by no means improbable that this section is one of those, perhaps not few in number, in which both interpreters had less regard to the literal sense of the words and to tradition than to their desire of forcing Badarayana's sutras to bear testimony to the truth of their own philosophic theories. With special reference to the Maya doctrine, one important sutra has yet to be considered, the only one in which the term Maya itself occurs, namely 3.2.3. According to Shankara, the sutra signifies that the environments of the dreaming soul are not real but mere Maya, that is, unsubstantial illusion, because they do not fully manifest the character of real objects. Ramanuja, as we have seen in the conspectus, gives a different explanation of the term Maya, but in judging of Shankara's views, we may for the time accept Shankara's own interpretation. Now, from the latter it clearly follows that if the objects seen in dreams are to be called Maya, that is, illusion, because not evincing the characteristics of reality, the objective world surrounding the waking soul must not be called Maya. But that the world perceived by waking men is Maya, even in a higher sense than the world presented to the dreaming consciousness, is an undoubted tenet of the Shankara Vedanta. And the sutra therefore proves either that Badarayana did not hold the doctrine of the illusory character of the world, or else that, if after all he did hold that doctrine, he used the term Maya in a sense altogether different from that in which Shankara employs it. If, on the other hand, we, with Ramanuja, understand the word Maya to denote a wonderful thing, the sutra of course has no bearing whatever on the doctrine of Maya in its later technical sense. We now turn to the question as to the relation of the individual soul to Brahman. Do the sutras indicate anywhere that their author held Shankara's doctrine, according to which the jiva is in reality identical with Brahman and separated from it, as it were, only by a false surmise due to avidya? Or do they rather favor the view that the souls, although they have sprung from Brahman and constitute elements of its nature, yet enjoy a kind of individual existence apart from it? This question is in fact only another aspect of the Maya question, but yet requires a short separate treatment. In the conspectus, I have given it as my opinion that the sutras in which the size of the individual soul is discussed can hardly be understood in Shankara's sense, and rather seem to favor the opinion, held among others by Ramanuja, that the soul is of minute size. We have further seen that Sutra 18 of the third pada of the second Adhyaya, which describes the soul as jna, is more appropriately understood in the sense assigned to it by Ramanuja, and, again, that the sutras which treat of the soul being an agent can be reconciled with Shankara's views only if supplemented in a way which their text does not appear to authorize. We next have the important Sutra 2.3.43, in which the soul is distinctly said to be a part, amsa, of Brahman, and which, as we have already noticed, can be made to fall in with Shankara's views only if amsa is explained, altogether arbitrarily, by amsa eva, while Ramanuja is able to take the sutra as it stands. We also have already referred to Sutra 50, quote, abhasa eva ka, end quote, which Shankara interprets as setting forth the so-called pratibimbavada, according to which the individual self is merely a reflection of the highest self. But almost every sutra, and Sutra 50 forms no exception, being so obscurely expressed that viewed by itself it admits of various, often totally opposed interpretations, the only safe method is to keep in view, in the case of each ambiguous aphorism, the general drift and spirit of the whole work, and that, as we have seen hitherto, is by no means favorable to the Pratibimba doctrine. How indeed could Sutra 50, if setting forth that latter doctrine, be reconciled with Sutra 43, which says distinctly that the soul is a part of Brahman? For that 43 contains, as Shankara and his commentators aver, a statement of the Avakkedavada, can itself be accepted only if we interpret amsa by amsa eva, and to do so there is really no valid reason whatever. I confess that Ramanuja's interpretation of the sutra, which however is accepted by several other commentators also, does not appear to me particularly convincing, and the sutras unfortunately offer us no other passages on the ground of which we might settle the meaning to be ascribed to the term abhasa, which may mean reflection, but may mean hetvabhasa, that is, fallacious argument, as well. But as things stand, this one sutra cannot, at any rate, be appealed to as proving that the Pratibimbavada, which, in its turn, presupposes the Mayavada, is the teaching of the Sutras. To the conclusion that the Sutrakara did not hold the doctrine of the absolute identity of the highest and the individual soul in the sense of Shankara, we are further led by some other indications to be met with here and there in the Sutras. In the conspectus of contents, we have had occasion to direct attention to the important Sutra 2.1.22, which distinctly enunciates that the Lord is adhika, that is, additional to, or different from, the individual soul, since Scripture declares the two to be different. Analogously, 1.2.20 lays stress on the fact that the Sarira is not the Antaryaman, because the Madhyandinas, as well as the Kanvas, speak of him in their texts as different, Vedana enam adhyate. And in 22, the Sarira and the Pradana are referred to as the two others, Itara'u, of whom the text predicates distinctive attributes separating them from the highest Lord. The word Itara, the other one, appears in several other passages, as a kind of technical term denoting the individual soul in contradistinction from the Lord. The Shankaras indeed maintain that all those passages refer to an unreal distinction due to avidya, but this is just what we should like to see proved, and the proof offered in no case amounts to more than a reference to the system which demands that the sutras should be thus understood. If we accept the interpretations of the school of Shankara, it remains altogether unintelligible why the Sutrakara should never hint even at what Shankara is anxious again and again to point out at length, namely, that the greater part of the work contains a kind of exoteric doctrine only, ever tending to mislead the student who does not keep in view what its nature is. If other reasons should make it probable that the Sutrakara was anxious to hide the true doctrine of the Upanishads as a sort of esoteric teaching, we might be more ready to accept Shankara's mode of interpretation. But no such reasons are forthcoming. Nowhere among the avowed followers of the Shankara system is there any tendency to treat the kernel of their philosophy as something to be jealously guarded and hidden. On the contrary, they all, from Gaudapada down to the most modern writer, consider it their most important, nay, only task to inculcate again and again in the clearest and most unambiguous language that all appearance of multiplicity is a vain illusion, that the Lord and the individual souls are in reality one, and that all knowledge but this one knowledge is without true value. There remains one more important passage concerning the relation of the individual soul to the highest self, a passage which attracted our attention above when we were reviewing the evidence for early divergence of opinion among the teachers of the Vedanta. I mean 1.4.20-22, which three sutras state the views of Asmaratya, Adalomi, and Kashakritsna, as to the reason why, in a certain passage of the Brihadaranyaka, characteristics of the individual soul are ascribed to the highest self. The Siddhanta view is announced in Sutra 22, Avastiter iti Kasakritsna, that is, Kasakritsna accounts for the circumstance mentioned on the ground of the, quote, permanent abiding or abode, end quote. By this permanent abiding, Shankara understands the Lord's abiding as, that is, existing as, or in the condition of, the individual soul, and thus sees in the sutra an enunciation of his own view that the individual soul is nothing but the highest self, avikrita paramesvaro jivonanya. Ramanuja, on the other hand, likewise accepting Kasakritsna's opinion as the Siddhanta view, explains avastiti as the Lord's permanent abiding within the individual soul, as described in the Antaryaman Brahmana. We can hardly maintain that the term avastiti cannot have the meaning ascribed to it by Shankara, namely special state or condition, but so much must be urged in favor of Ramanuja's interpretation that in the 5 other places where avastiti or anavastiti is met within the sutras, it regularly means permanent abiding or permanent abode within something. End of section 8.